Welcome to Cold War Conversations.
This is the British Broadcasting Corporation.
Fünf, zwei, sieben, eins, sechs, neun, acht, drei.
Well, who's our first letter from today, Edward?
An old friend of yours, Doris, Brian Hartley of Thornton-le-Field, asking what's being done to build up Anglo-Soviet relations.
And I'm here to host this final program from the German Democratic Republic for you.
Welcome to episode 10 of Cold War Conversations. Today we're moving away from the GDR and Czechoslovakia to the Soviet Union. But before we start, a quick plug for our Facebook group. We have veterans, academics and fascinated amateurs like myself contributing and discussing the subjects raised by the podcast. Just search Cold War Conversations on Facebook. You'll be made very welcome. So, back to the Soviet Union. Today's guest is Jeremy Poynton, who was a 16-year-old schoolboy in 1968 when he embarked on a memorable trip by road from Leningrad to Odessa. He vividly describes the Soviet Union still struggling with poverty and a diverse range of peoples from city dwellers to remote Chechen villages. It's a unique story as Jeremy details his experiences and the sights of a 1960s Soviet Union just as the Prague Spring was being suppressed. I hope you enjoy our chat as much as I did. We welcome Jeremy Poynton. Hi, Jeremy. How are you tonight?
Hi, Ian. I'm fine, thank you. Good to talk to you.
Yes, no, great. Thank you very much for coming on Cold War Conversations. I'm looking forward to hearing about your epic journey across the USSR. Now, I understand that this was a school trip. Can you tell me a little bit about your school?
Yeah, the Leeds School in Cambridge, I would classify as probably a second-string public school, though I got a very good education there. Probably the last generation to get a proper classical education. And as I noted, I think, to you, we actually had a Russian teacher there. He mostly did French, but he spoke fluent Russian, and I would think about 5 or 6 of us probably did O-level, with a view to hopefully getting the exam, but really to be able to get onto the school trip. I think he'd been there before himself once or twice, but had never done a school trip there before. I do recall it took an awful lot of organisation.
Well, I was going to ask you that because I was wondering what your parents thought of you going off to the Soviet Union.
Well, they thought it was great, actually.
I could read a lot into that, Jeremy.
Well, no, they were. I mean, politically, they were classic old school liberals. We were from the northwest near Manchester, and that was very much an old school pre-social democrat liberal stronghold up there. Mum and Dad were definitely liberals, I would say.
Okay.
They certainly didn't think much of the Iron Curtain and the Eastern Bloc, but then nobody did.
Right. So they weren't worried about you not coming back and ending up in the Lubyanka or anything like that?
No, I don't think so. They might have thought that was possibly a bonus.
Now, I think you mentioned to me that the teacher who led the trip, Mr. Armstrong, had been to the USSR before, so he sort of knew his way a little bit around the country. He
did certainly, and I believe, I don't know what the state of play was at the end of the Iron Curtain, but certainly when we went there, I think if you planned any sort of visit, it had to be, all the stops had to be agreed, and if it was any sort of group visit, you had someone from Intourist, the Russian or the Soviet state tourist agency, accompanied you all the time.
Right. Okay. And the other, because how old were you at the time?
I was 16. I think I had my 17th birthday in Rostov-on-Don.
Oh, lovely. Lovely. Yeah. I bet you remember that.
I do, yes.
So, what about the rest of the party? Because I think there was Mr. Armstrong, another teacher,
And another teacher, Mr. Chamberlain, an old boy who I guess has probably been gone for a couple of years, and I think probably seven or eight of us current pupils.
Okay, and
squeezed into the two vehicles.
Wow, and of those current pupils, were they all of the same, political persuasion as you, or were some of them more left wing? Or
as a teenager, I was never that particularly interested in politics, and I think, in general, one might say 50 years ago, people were less interested in politics because we didn't have the media in our faces all the time.
Yeah.
So I wasn't that interested in it. I didn't really know, for example, whether I was conservative or Labour, right wing or left wing. I was aware that communism and whatever systems we had in the West were pretty directly opposed. I didn't know much about the gory history of the Soviet Union, for example. I knew, obviously, Stalin was a dictator. I knew there had been a bloody revolution. But I wasn't as politically attuned, shall we say, as a modern-day teenager would be.
Right. So you weren't. So it sounds like you said you had a classical education. Your history teaching was more in the classics rather than modern history. Would that be?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, I didn't do history. I gave up history to do Russian.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. And
yes.
It sounds like you had rather unusual travel, how can I put it, vehicles that you were using to get around the Soviet Union.
Well, looking back on it, it seems completely insane, but we managed fine. We had one or two hairy things. The jack didn't work on the dormobile when a tire went flat, so we actually had to hold it up the rest of the party while the tire was put on. But from what I remember, we had very little trouble.
Gosh, well, that's amazing, because, vehicles in those days were not necessarily renowned for their reliability, but I guess they were simpler and easier to fix.
I think so.
And
yes, I think so.
If you could just describe, because the vehicles that you told me about is the Bedford Dormobile, which, go on.
Bedford Dormobile, which was a classic, kind of similar, very similar to a Volkswagen.
So like a Volkswagen camper van sort of thing.
Camper thing, yeah.
Okay, and that's
very basic. We brought minimum clothing and tents, basically, and some food to keep us going.
Right.
But we had very little, as you can imagine. We had the boot of the Morris Minor and the back and the roof of the van. And that was it, basically.
Wow. And this was a Morris Minor convertible, so it didn't even have a roof on it.
No, wonderful car.
Wow. So how did you get across to the Soviet Union? Because you didn't, drive through Europe, did you?
No, we got a boat. I think it was a Russian line of some sort. I think it might have been a cruise ship, but it might not. It was very basic. It was fine. We had a very stormy passage, I do remember. Everyone was throwing up. We stopped at Copenhagen and had a wander around there. We stopped at Helsinki and had a wander around there. And then came into Leningrad, as it was, of course, then, early of a morning.
Okay. And did you, presumably you came in past the Kronstadt fortress?
That's right, yes.
Wow.
Yes.
Okay.
So I didn't know much about it then. I wish I had.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. Well, I appreciate the photos that you've been posting today on Twitter. They've given me some great insight into what you were seeing there. That was much appreciated. And I'll put up some links to that on the Cold War Conversations website. So you arrive in Leningrad. The vehicles presumably are winched off this liner onto the quay. And are you greeted by some in-tourist guide who then leads you
I would have thought so. I don't remember immigration, as it were, at all. I really don't remember the procedures or anything, but I would have thought so, that we would have had someone attached to us at that point.
Yeah. Okay.
I think probably the first thing we did was go off and we were actually camped, in fact, about 40 or 50 kilometers north of Leningrad for some reason. I can't remember why that was, but we were. So I suspect that we went out there first and set up camp, and then maybe went back into Leningrad after that. I have to say I'm hazy on a lot of the details as to how long we stayed at places.
No, I can imagine it was some time ago. So don't worry,
Yes.
I'm not going to want an hour by hour account. But I mean, I'm just fascinated to sort of hear your views of the place and what you saw and what you experienced. So what did you make of Leningrad?
Leningrad definitely preferred it to Moscow, which was grey and hot and dusty. Leningrad was, well, as we know, was designed to be with water around it. Run down, but still obviously a beautiful city.
Yeah, and can you remember if the tour guide sort of took you to see, like the Aurora, the cruiser that fired the opening shots of the revolution?
We did. We saw that, where it was docked. I don't think we went on board, but I do remember seeing that, yes.
Okay, and presumably the Winter Palace was on the list as well.
Winter Palace. We were actually... we were allowed to wander around on our own or in small groups in the cities, meeting again. We didn't have to be attended all the time. I do remember, just being astonished by the Orthodox cathedrals and churches everywhere, how wonderful they were and how rococo and different to our own very plain churches back here in England.
Yeah.
The other thing that struck me was the services were attended by the very old and very few young people. It was almost all old women in black and a few young people looking slightly uncomfortable. Right. Yeah.
Right. And did you have much interaction with the locals? Did they want to talk to you?
Insofar as most of us pupils only spoke very basic Russian, what we could. I will say that almost wherever we went, if you had to queue for anything, we were always ushered to the front of the queue, which is very kind. And I do remember in Moscow myself and a friend of mine, we went and had a couple of hours at the zoo and got on a bus, and they wouldn't let us pay.
Wow.
And they realized that we were foreign. It was, one didn't feel I'm amongst the enemy, shall we say.
Yeah, they were very, very friendly, probably just intrigued, because I think what people forget is how isolated, people in the Soviet Union would have been, because they wouldn't be picking up TV broadcasts from anywhere else. Obviously, there was no internet. It was just purely Soviet media that they would be receiving.
I think that was absolutely it, that they wanted to know what was happening in the West.
Right.
Yes.
Which we will come on to in a moment.
Well, yes, obviously that got fairly well concentrated, but that was a general sort of what's going on out there. We don't really know what's happening anywhere except here. And, well, obviously there's a lot of times when it was implied that we don't really know what's happening here.
Yes, yeah.
You did get people looking over their shoulders when they spoke to you at times.
Yeah. No, I can imagine. And I think you said that you had quite a lot of interest in your Levi's.
Yes, I wish I'd known. I wish I'd known, because they were such a status symbol there. People would pay an absolute ridiculous fortune for them.
Oh, gee, you would have ended up with rubles, which wouldn't have...
Yes, I know. It's hopeless.
You couldn't have got out or changed.
No, exactly. But and also you could get... I didn't do it, but you could get very good black market rates for selling dollars or sterling, because there were shops and hotels where you could only use foreign exchange. So if, for example, you wanted a good coffee and a nice pastry, you'd have to go to a hotel. You wouldn't be able to pay for it unless you had dollars or sterling. So people would offer you silly amounts of rubles compared to the exchange rate for $4 or sterling, yeah.
Right. And I presume this is when your in-tourist guide wasn't around, they'd be doing this?
Yes, again, a bit shuffly, shall we say. Someone would shuffle up to you and... Bares I wanted as well. Bares.
Bares. Yeah. Wow. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And I can imagine, you thought, I wish I'd brought a few more of these with me.
Well, exactly, yeah. Or just hand them out like sweets.
Yeah.
As it were.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned, or you told me that in Leningrad and Moscow, you had people come up who wanted to show you some of the cemeteries.
Yes, absolutely. The cemeteries in both cities were quite extraordinary, vast, and obviously cemeteries, but very different to our own in that there were often photographs of the person who died, and there were often tools of trade or similar, including one of a pilot with a quite tall obelisk with a full-size propeller affixed to it.
Gosh.
Which I wish I'd photographed, but I think I only had a couple of rolls of things. But yes, and a lot of them was, the stories of their lives and things, which our teacher translated. And a lot, of course, famous, I can't remember who, politicians, writers, with various famous Russians buried in them.
Okay, and I understand that in one of these cemeteries, you had a Czech student approach.
We did. In fact, this happened twice. One was in the cemetery, and the other, I think, possibly near another one. I can only assume there were I know there were a lot of Czech students in Moscow at the university there. I can only assume that they were all being watched, because both times it happened really very quickly. A student had come up to us and started talking.
Yeah, and then what happened?
We had the first time was a plainclothes policeman who pulled a gun on him, generally sort of waved it around, and marched him off.
Yeah.
And the next time, a plainclothes policeman with a soldier with a rifle appeared and marched the fellow off. So after that, we basically would ward people off if we thought they might be Czechs.
Yeah, because you left in July, so before the end of the Prague Spring.
That's right. We left in July and left middle of July and left right at the end of August. So during that time, we knew obviously of what had happened before, but we had no idea of what was to follow. Right.
So you had you didn't know that Dubček had been, the tanks had gone into Czechoslovakia.
No. Okay. We saw somewhere Pravda with the headline "Great Victory for Soviet Diplomacy." Which we couldn't really read anything into.
Yeah.
We just knew there'd been trouble, and obviously it had been sorted out one way or another, but no, until we left, we didn't know.
Right. And while you were away, did you have any communication with, well, it sounds like you didn't have any communication with your parents, so did you send postcards or anything?
I think I probably sent a couple of postcards.
Yeah.
In Moscow, we popped into the embassy because they recommend that you go to the embassy and register your presence.
Yeah.
So we did that. I do remember I asked if they could get me the test match score, and about 10 minutes later it came off the telex.
That's what I call proper English.
Absolutely. I mean, I was an am cricket mad, so I thought I'd risk it because I knew there was a test match on. But bless them, they went off and got it.
I thought that's what all those consulates and embassies were for.
I think so.
Traveling English people wanting to know the test score.
No, I think so, definitely.
So I think you mentioned that between Leningrad and Moscow, you stopped at Novgorod as well.
Novgorod, which is an old city, very beautiful. Absolutely fantastic. The original walled city is extraordinary. Very beautiful indeed, and very striking.
Yeah. No, I saw one of your photos of Novgorod.
Yes, I read up a little bit more about it because, of course, I remembered these places, but apart from obviously about Leningrad, St. Petersburg, and Moscow, that's about it, really.
Yeah.
But I believe it is quite a sort of architectural gem, the fortress, the walled city.
Yeah. Yeah. So when you were on the road, I mean, you just camped anywhere, or
No, we had to camp at pre-assigned and pre-agreed campsites.
right?
So we had to always make sure we were at them, etc., etc.
Otherwise, they get the search party out, I presume.
Yes. Or, well, as you know, as I mentioned later, we had problems because of that.
Yeah.
So, you had to have every place you were striking camp, as it were, you had to be on the pre-agreed list.
Right. And what about filling up with petrol and things like that? Was that quite easy to do, or was that?
Well, I think we must have managed. We were, apart from going up into Chechnya, we were always on main roads, really.
Right.
Okay, big distances, but for example, after Moscow, we went through, I think, Kursk and Kharkov.
Mm-hmm.
And we may even have gone to Rostov-on-Don then before, down to the Caucasus and Pyatigorsk. But it was all main roads, certainly further south, not very much on them for long periods.
Yeah.
But they were all main routes.
Yeah, because you described to me, after leaving Moscow and going on to the Caucasus, a lot of road and rolling steps, and not a lot there. But you talked about stopping at a very poor village. Can you describe a little bit about that?
Yes, I must say I can't remember where that was, but I think it was not that far south of Moscow. I think we stopped. I don't know. There was a funeral going on with people walking the coffin, and I think we stopped probably out of respect. And then I noticed that the deceased person in the coffin had pennies on their eyes, which I know was a tradition certainly in Ireland, and I think parts of the UK way back, but I didn't know it was still practiced anywhere.
Yeah.
And yes, and then the coffin was taken into the local little church.
Right.
The people there were terribly poor. That was very clear. Poorly clothed and looking somewhat stunted and ill.
Right.
No, that's it.
Okay, because so you could see quite a difference in the quality of life between living in a city like Moscow and Leningrad versus being out in some of the more isolated rural areas.
Yes, definitely. And even though somewhat downtrodden and grubby, shall we say, in parts of Leningrad and Moscow, definitely better heeled, for lack of a better term, than the countryside. Yeah, which I think really had not changed in decades, really.
Yeah. Wow.
Yes, it was very striking because, of course, I'd never seen anything like that before.
Yeah. And was there any evidence of like the World War II battles or anything like that you saw?
I don't remember.
Yeah.
I don't remember. Certainly, we didn't go near any of the big ones, for example.
No.
Stalingrad or anywhere. We missed
I was
that.
interested because you mentioned you went near Kursk, and obviously that was the large tank battle. But I was just interested if you'd seen anything.
Yes, no, I don't think so. I don't think so. Kursk and Kharkov, I don't remember at all, I have to say.
That wasn't. You weren't hitting the vodka at that point, were you?
No, I think they were very drab, frankly.
Yeah,
they were very, very drab indeed, is what I remember.
So a bit like once you've seen one Soviet town, you've seen almost all of them to some degree.
Yes, yeah, very, very much so.
Yeah, but you say that once you got into the Caucasus, the scenery perked up, let's say.
Well, the scenery perked up and the people perked up, shall we say. I think it certainly felt lighter that way, down that way, I would say. I'm not quite sure why, but Pyatigorsk, I do remember, was very pretty. I think we stayed a couple of days there. It had a beautiful lake. It had a viewing point, which I think was a memorial to the writer Lermontov.
Okay.
Which looked out over the Caucasus. So that was rather fine. What else did we have there? Yes, going up into the Caucasus, we ran into a bunch of shepherds on the side of the road who just slaughtered a sheep and insisted we had kebab with them, or shashlik as it's called down there, which is absolutely gorgeous. Done on the spot, to die for. I also remember there that out of the hill there were metal pipes coming out with carbonated water, actually coming out of the hillside there, fizzy water.
So none of those Evian bottles. It was just pouring out of the side of a hill.
No, just absolutely pouring out the side of the hill. And there is, I know, somewhere near there called Mineralny Vodya, I think. So mineral water, I believe.
Right.
So it's obviously famous, I guess, for sparkling water.
Yeah.
Yes.
Now, tell me about one of the marvels of Soviet road building, the Trans-Caucasian Highway.
The Trans-Caucasian or the Georgian Military Highway, we were told about that with great pride and how it was a magnificent feat of engineering going all the way through the Caucasus into Georgia. We hit it, and after about 200 yards of tarmac, it was basically the riverbed again. When they built it, they'd forgotten to factor in the fact that there are flash floods every winter. And it just gets washed away every time they rebuild it back then. So basically it was, as I guess it had been for centuries, really, riverbed with potholes and boulders which you manoeuvred your way around.
Yeah.
I think it probably was cleared occasionally. I don't know. We didn't see any bulldozers or anything, but because it was the main highway and the military highway, they must have kept it clear somehow.
Yeah. I mean, I'm amazed your vehicles held up, that long. Because I looked at it on Google Maps, and I reckon you'd done about 3,000 miles by the time you got to Odessa.
Yes, I would think so. In the Soviet Union, absolutely alone. And in fact, we then drove through Italy, part of Turkey, Italy and France going back. So that was another 1,500 or so. I'm absolutely amazed. I can only assume, I don't remember, that both of the teachers were good mechanically.
Yeah. I was going to say it was a tribute to British engineering.
I think so, yes.
Now, you get into the Caucasus, and apparently you did a bit of a detour into Chechnya. Yes,
we did. I can't remember how it came about. I think it was very much, shall we, or what the hell? And we did it. In tourist guide we had for the second half of the journey was a drunk. So basically we took no notice of him, really. But at some point, we side road, we went up into Chechnya. I don't know how far, 20 or 30 miles, I would say. We came across, in fact, we stopped and came across a village on the side of the road, which was positively medieval. All the inhabitants were still in furs with ancient muskets, and all in stone houses. All around the village, there were buildings that they were stone, but they mostly looked like beehives. When we looked closer, they were actually stuffed ossuaries, in effect. They were stuffed full of skeletons and bones.
Right.
And we found out that they'd had plagues there regularly. And if you came down with the plague, you got put in one of those and isolated and died, basically.
Wow. So I'd imagine you didn't want to stay there too long.
No, it was a bit extraordinary going up and seeing they were rams. There were one or two which just had one or two skeletons in, and if you were rich, apparently, you could have your own charnel house, for lack of a better term, to die in. Otherwise, you were just crammed in with everyone else.
Wow. And so when you got back on the agreed route, what did the authorities think of your excursion?
We were hauled off. I can't remember. I think we were actually stopped on the road, so the word must have gone out, and hauled off to the local police station. I think they just told us we were very dreadful people and go on our way, because we weren't charged with anything formally. We were told that we were endangering the 5-year plan, which I think probably produced some sniggering amongst us boys.
Yeah.
It was a classic Soviet Union thing. The 5-year plan was a thing of mockery, even back in the 1970s.
Yeah.
5-year plan and tractor stats.
Wow.
But I think we were just told off very firmly that we mustn't
Yeah.
do that. Otherwise, the economic future of the Soviet Union could be in danger.
Yeah, and it sounds like you were quite a long way from the nearest British consulate where you were.
I would think so. Yeah, I would think to Tbilisi, I think probably would have been the next. I think we were probably 50 or 60 miles away, I should think.
Right.
Then, yes.
Okay.
And they wouldn't have known what to do with us anyway.
No. So you move on into Georgia. Can you tell me a little bit about what that was like?
Georgia was nice because there was a sudden change in the terrain, as it were. It's not a Mediterranean country, but it might have as well have been. It's warm, quite verdant in a lot of places. Cafes out on the streets, people eating and drinking in the streets. Just a slightly more normal feeling than the rest of the Soviet Union that we'd left behind.
Yeah.
Food was nicer in the cafes. The food back in most of the Soviet Union in the cafes, apart from the railway stations, which were renowned and were good, the food was absolutely ghastly in ordinary cafes.
Oh,
it
really?
was sort of noodles and gristle, really, in a gruel.
That sounds so appetizing, Jeremy.
Yeah, absolutely. But no, Georgia was lovely, and there were vineyards, and you could get a glass of wine at the side of the road, and people were friendly and smiling. Well, yeah, I guess like being in Turkey or somewhere like that, really. Definitely a switch in mood. Yeah. I don't remember a lot about Tbilisi itself. Apart, we camped on the edge, and we had a massive electrical storm every evening at 6 o'clock, sort of just like clockwork. I do remember a lot of the old churches where we travelled around in Georgia. Very beautiful, many abandoned, Orthodox, some with frescoes inside.
Yeah. Okay. And did you visit Joseph Stalin's birthplace?
We certainly did in Gori, yes. That was a must.
Yeah.
We couldn't have gone all that way. It's the house he was born and brought up in, but it's encased in a sort of a marble casing, as it were, a roof and marble pillars to hold it up, which is a bit odd. I can't remember anything in it in terms of items and articles related to his upbringing, apart from the paintings on the wall, which all, of course, featured him in an heroic mode, and didn't feature Lenin, who'd pretty much been disappeared by that time.
Right.
One or two of them might have had Lenin sort of peering out of the back, as it were, looking over a shoulder, going, "I'm here," but you wouldn't really have known that Lenin had been there had you not known that Lenin had been there, if you see what I mean. Early piece of photoshopping.
And I wouldn't imagine they'd get many Western tourists down there.
I don't think so, no. I don't think they would have done, no.
And the people sort of like looking after the museum, were they friendly, or were they looking at you as lackeys of the capitalist West?
No, from everywhere I remember, from the Hermitage to any sort of local place like that, no, they I think were pleased that people from the West should come and look at these things.
Yeah.
That's not patronising, because, I mean, the Hermitage, even to a sort of stupid 16-year-old, was a thing of wonder. To see so much extraordinary art. Yeah. All over the place was you could spend a life in there and not see it all, for sure.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. We did in some places have people show us some of the fantastic sort of Soviet-style heroic statuary and a snigger of it, as it. We had one guy, somewhere near Tbilisi, I think, who said, our statues, they're not very tasty, meaning tasteless.
Yeah.
But we agreed, yeah.
And presumably there were still statues of Stalin around then as well.
I think there were, yeah. I think there were probably statues of Stalin, statues of Marx. Somewhere in the Caucasus, painted on a huge cliff, was "Long live Stalin" in Russian in sort of 10-foot high letters. When that had been done, I don't know, but obviously he's still got a degree of popularity back in his homeland.
Yeah. Yeah. So you then move on to Sochi.
Yes, Sochi. It's a tourist place. Even back then, it was sort of one of the tourist places. If you were high on the party, you went to Sochi for your summer holidays.
Right.
I remember it as rather pretty. I remember tables all along the esplanade, as it were, along the side of the beach with chess tables on them. Hundreds and hundreds, I think, it seemed to me. Everybody was playing chess.
Yeah.
People in their swimming trunks. So they were relaxed, as opposed to not so further north. Yes, it was a holiday resort, Soviet style.
Yeah.
We again broke the rules and slept on the beach one night rather than the campsite we were meant to.
Mm.
It was right by, I guess, what was a holiday camp, a Butlins or a Pontins, as it were. But at 6 o'clock in the morning, we were woken by the speakers booming martial music, and suddenly everyone in the camp shot out, jumping over us onto the beach and into the sea, hurled themselves into the sea, leaving us decadent Westerners fast asleep in our sleeping bags.
Yeah. God, dear.
It was a bit carry on Soviet camping.
Yeah, Heidi High.
Yes.
And I think you mentioned something about educating the locals about football, and I know you have a fondness for a certain team.
Football, the conversation that was actually up in the village in Chechnya, believe it or not. So how we communicated with them, I don't know, but they knew of Manchester United. I, being of the other persuasion, told them about Manchester City and made it clear that they were more important than Manchester United. So who knows? My work may have been done there.
Well, you might find even to this day there is a small Manchester City supporters club in a remote village in Chechnya.
Yes, absolutely.
So from Sochi, you move on to Odessa, which was the last town that you stayed in. What do you remember of Odessa?
That's right. Odessa was rather fine. The Potemkin Steps, of course, in the Eisenstein film, we went to see, and they are absolutely amazing. Yes, rather pretty city by the sea. We went to the opera. The opera house was rather fine. I didn't really get on with the opera, being a 16-year-old. What we hadn't realized when we went off to see the opera and when we left the boat was that you were meant to take your passports with you in order to get back on. Because as the boat was leaving the Soviet Union at that point, obviously people would try to get on to get the hell out.
Yeah.
So when we got back about 10 o'clock, having left a bit early, we were told in no uncertain terms with rifles pointed at us that there was no way we were getting on this boat and we would be staying in Odessa, which was a bit alarming. But I think it was a case of Mr. Armstrong coming along and sorting it out.
Yeah. Wow. So I might not have even been talking to you today. You might have still been there.
No, I might still be labouring in the camps there.
Yeah. Wow. So, I mean, of your trip, I mean, it sounds like an amazing sort of, trip. What would you say is your most abiding memory of the trip?
The churches and the monasteries.
Right.
Because they were so astonishing and so different. Yeah. The Hermitage Museum was quite extraordinary. The Caucasus, because they're a big mountain range, and I've never seen one before.
Right.
Friendliness of people. Never anywhere, I think, did we feel we're unwelcome.
Yeah.
Okay, neutral a lot of the time, but never anywhere did I feel that even though technically we were the enemy, as it were, west for east, that we were seen as that at all.
Yeah. Wow. No, that's really, that's really interesting. Was there anything that sort of really surprised you? You must have gone with some preconceptions of what the Soviet Union was like. Was there anything that you sort of thought, God, I never thought they would be like that, or, something like that?
Yeah, I mean, everything we saw around us obviously had huge similarities to the West, but it was all terribly degraded and poorly built and sad and sorry.
Yeah.
The housing estates, you really would be very oppressive to live in, I think. They were cement
Yeah.
and grey and blank.
Yeah.
So I think when you got out of city centres and things, you did think, I really wouldn't want to live here. It must be oppressive and crushing.
Yeah. And did you...
which it was.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Were there a lot of propaganda posters and things like that around?
Yes, quite a lot. In fact, I came back with two huge posters, one of Marx and one of Lenin, neither of which survived long because they've been printed on very poor paper.
Right.
And a copy of the manifesto of the Communist Party I bought somewhere for a couple of kopecks or something.
Yeah.
As a memento. But I never read it in English or in Russian.
No, I would imagine that would have made a very good doorstop.
Yes.
That was really interesting. Is there anything else you want to, you think I've missed out? Or
just thinking, I had a couple of things whiz through my head. The British Embassy is very beautifully placed in Moscow as it looks over to the Kremlin, over the river. Mm-hmm. We did go into the Kremlin. You can go to parts of it. And saw the extraordinary Fabergé, the jeweled eggs.
Oh, yeah.
The collection there, which were quite extraordinary. And it did make you aware of the difference between the wealth and the poverty in Russia at the time of the revolution.
Yeah.
Not entirely surprising it happened.
Now, what I normally do, Jeremy, is I do ask my guests a few other questions which aren't necessarily related to the subject that we've been talking about, and I've realised that I haven't sort of prepared you for these. But if anything comes to mind, then feel free to share. But do you have a favourite Cold War movie?
Well, there's a Spy Who Came In From the Cold, which I watched when it came out and watched again recently. Early. John le Carré, Smiley with Richard Burton.
And how did you find that watching it a second time round? Did you?
Oh, fantastic!
Still had the same impact.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, the sheer seediness of everything.
Yeah.
On both sides. Yeah. Very good.
Brilliant film.
Yes, The Manchurian Candidate, which has always been a favourite of mine.
Yeah.
A slightly different aspect, career, obviously.
Yeah.
But the Cold War. Bridge of Spies, the Spielberg movie quite recently, which I thought was better than I expected, with Tom Hanks.
Yes, it was. Yeah, I'd agree with you there. I thought they were going to really give it the big Hollywood treatment, but they did keep it relatively
yes,
real.
It was quite good. Yeah, I would think the ultimate. I guess the ultimate for me would be the TV serialization of Tinker Tailor with Alec Guinness, the 6-part one, which I just think was absolutely brilliant, and better than the film. The film was too quick, really.
Well, yeah, I think that's
if you see what I mean.
Yeah, with that TV series, they could pace it much better.
Yes.
Whereas with the film, you've got to try and squeeze in a complex story.
Yes, absolutely. I thought the film was good, but I thought the TV series was just absolutely brilliant at the time, and again when I rewatched it a few years ago.
Yeah. Now, when you were in the Soviet Union, you were 16. What sort of music were you into then?
At that time, well, Beatles, Stones.
Yeah.
I was just getting into music from what was called West Coast rock, Jefferson Airplane and the Grateful Dead. The school I was at in Cambridge had a lot of kids of local dons.
Right.
And academics.
Yeah.
So I got to hang out with some interesting people there. Kane's family, for example.
Oh, wow. As in John Maynard.
Yeah. They're great. He was their great uncle.
Yeah.
But Mum was a direct descendant of Darwin as well. We were hugely into Dylan. A lot of our friends had American lodgers. So as I said, they were bringing in albums by Jefferson Airplane, Grateful Dead. Yeah, so a lot of the fairly mad music that afflicted us in the middle of the 60s, really.
Yeah. Now, I did a bit of research on your school earlier, and it looks like you had various Tonganese royalty.
Yes.
There.
I was at school with the current King of Bahrain, in fact.
Well, there you go.
We haven't kept in touch.
Oh, that's a shame.
I know.
He didn't come on the trip with you, did he?
No, he didn't.
But some very well-known names. So
a few. Yeah, well, I mean, I was very lucky.
Yeah.
My father worked himself into the ground to send his 3 boys there. I was a smart little fella, so I enjoyed it, and had very good teachers. I feel very privileged, but worked hard and learned a lot, and had a good time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Christopher and Peter Hitchens were both old Lesians.
Yeah, no, I saw that on there as well. Yeah, it was a veritable who's who when I was looking through it. Now, another question I ask is, if you could invite 3 personalities from the Cold War for a chat or a pint, who would you want to talk to, would you think?
Well, Mikhail Gorbachev, I would think, would have to be one.
Yeah.
And given that, it'd probably have to be Ronald Reagan. And then it would probably have to be someone from the beginning of the revolution who wasn't too appalling.
That's going to be quite a short list, I would have thought.
It is, isn't it? Yeah. Who was the guy who Lenin shoved out? Kerensky, was it?
Oh, he was the leader of the provisional government, and then Trotsky got the ice pick in Mexico City, didn't he?
Yes, that's right. But Kerensky was shafted because, and was that his name? I think it would have to be him, the guy who set up the provisional government and then got shafted because he wasn't radical enough. But I think it'd probably have to be Reagan and Gorbachev.
Yeah, no, that's a good mixture there. That's good. Yeah. And just looking at sort of like current TV and films, and we've sort of touched on it to some degree, but is there a good film recently that you think has, or not so recently, that sort of captures the sort of feeling of the Cold War? And I know you mentioned Bridge of Spies, but
yeah, there's one does come to mind, Dr. Strangelove.
Oh, I've been waiting for somebody to mention that one.
that does, to a certain degree, capture some of the aspect of it, because it was cold, but it was also fevered.
Yeah.
A lot of the time, it was fevered. Yeah. So I think in many ways it would have to be Strangelove, because it cranks it up.
Yeah, no, that's a great choice. We'd definitely have that on the list. I mean, what after you left school, what did you do you mind me asking what you ended up, what career you ended up going into?
I ended up in IT, but about 10 years. I went to Oxford University.
Yeah.
And then I got a degree. I so fed up books. I did manual labor and worked as a printer, and I worked for a guy, the original lights guy for the Pink Floyd.
Yeah.
Around the time of Sid Barrett, I worked for him making stuff for lightings for a bit.
Yeah.
And then I got a family and a mortgage and thought I'd better get a career. So I went into IT about the age of 29.
Right.
And that's what I did till I retired.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a bit of a hippie, really. Yeah. Bit of a hippie. I do feel privileged. I did get lucky. I think one thing I did realise from that, Ian, is that it's never the people of a country who are at war with each other. It's always the governments.
Yeah. No, and that's very much apparent from your descriptions there. You're saying there's no animosity there whatsoever. There's a curiousness. Well, Jeremy, that has been great. Really fascinating.
Yeah, well, I'm pleased to share it. It's been sitting there for 50 years, so it might as well have an airing. Yeah,
no, well, I'm delighted that you've allowed me to have a chat with you and tease out some of these gems that you've given us tonight. It's been a pleasure to speak to you.
Yeah, good fun.
All right, thank you. Take care.
Yeah, bye.
See you. Bye. I do hope you enjoyed our chat with Jeremy. If you'd like to understand more about the subjects, books and films we discussed, there's links in the show notes at coldwarconversations.com/episode and the number 10. Don't forget, you can join our discussion group on Facebook. Just search Cold War Conversations. And we're also on Twitter at Cold War Pod. If you like what you're hearing, please leave reviews on iTunes or with your podcast provider. Thank you very much for listening.
This is the Voice of America, Washington, D.C., signing off.